Hello, and welcome to another edition of Mr. Lash's Digital Classroom. Today we're going to be talking about the Wars of the Roses, which lasted from approximately 1455 to 1487. Today, though, we're just going to be talking about the first 5 years. The use of the term roses in reference to these wars dates back to Shakespeare. So during the 15th century, they actually didn't call it the Wars of the Roses. It was actually just a dispute between the Lancastrians and the Yorkists. The Lancastrians used the red rose to signify their side, while the Yorkists used the white rose. As we've already discussed with regards to Henry VI, he was a weak king, prone to bouts of insanity. So instead of him ruling most of the time, the actual governing of the kingdom oftentimes to his wife, Margaret of Anjou, a Frenchwoman who relied on a close network of family and supporters to establish her authority. The goal of all of Margaret's manipulations and scheming and plays for power was to make sure that her son Edward ended up on the throne of England. Leading the Yorkists was Richard, Duke of York. Richard was a powerful nobleman who had experience leading men in battle. He had fought the Scots, he had fought the French, and he had even fought the Irish. His chief ally was Richard Neville, the Earl of Warwick, also known as the Kingmaker. Together, Richard and Richard Neville controlled the frontiers of English society, in contrast to the Lancastrians, whose power came from central England. So one of the ways to think about the conflict of the Wars of the Roses is to think about the Yorkists as frontier lords and the Lancastrians as closer to central authority. Now, there are a number of causes of the Wars of the Roses. The first is the financial problems that came as a result of the end of the Hundred Years' War. The war was incredibly expensive, and the French were actually taking land from the English at the end of it. Although this wouldn't pose a lot of problems, you have a number of soldiers who wanted to get paid. You had debts that had been incurred. And to pay these off, Henry VI, and by extension Margaret of Anjou, had to tax the nobility to pay these debts back. This is not going to make them incredibly popular. At the same time, you have the breakdown of feudal authority. Rather than the king giving land to his supporters, now he's sort of having to give them IOUs. And finally, you have the increased factionalism. And I'm going to go into what that means, increased factionalism, a little bit. Now, in a typical feudal society, at the top you have the king. And below the king, you have his chief advisors. Powerful noblemen like Richard, Duke of York, and Richard Neville of Warwick. Because of his bouts of insanity, Margaret of Anjou began not just helping Henry rule, but actually ruling in his place. This was incredibly insulting to men like Richard, Duke of York, and Richard Neville, who felt that it was their right as noblemen to advise the king, and especially for a man like Richard, Duke of York, who felt that if the king is injured or incapacitated in some way, it's not the queen who should take over for him. Instead, it should be someone of royal blood, someone like himself who descended from a king. Eventually, this sense of dishonor is going to become so strong, and the feeling that it's not Henry that's actually ruling anymore, it's Margaret of Anjou who's ruling, that Richard, Duke of York, will rebel, claiming that he is the rightful heir to the throne, that he should be king, and that Henry VI cannot be trusted anymore. Now, Richard knew that he couldn't technically depose Henry VI. He was God's appointed king. So what he was actually arguing for was not so much to get rid of Henry VI, but to say, after Henry VI, I will be king, Richard, Duke of York. And if I'm not around anymore when that happens, then my eldest living son and heir should become king. Now, Richard had 3 sons. These 3 sons will actually become a bit of a problem when we get to the later stages of the Wars of the Roses, but let's introduce them right now. You have Edward, later becoming Edward IV, King of England, the eldest son, the middle son, George, and finally the youngest son, Richard, who will also become King of England as Richard III. Now, one of the most striking things that's going to happen during the Wars of the Roses is an increase in violence. One of the reasons we're going to see this stark increase in violence amongst the nobility is that they're not going to be ransoming off lords anymore. During the 100 Years' War, if an Englishman took a French knight captive, Well, he wanted money from that French knight. He had no intention of taking that French knight's land. However, during the Wars of the Roses, noblemen were fighting not for the other lord's money, but they had the real possibility of taking that lord's land away from him if they won. So lords began killing other nobility, not so much out of hatred, not so much out of just, battlefield viciousness, but because they wanted their land. So what you're going to begin, and this actually begins with the Yorkists begin slaughtering the nobility, is that eventually Richard, Duke of York, is going to be killed in 1460. Once Richard is dead, Edward, his son, will take over the Yorkist cause. Edward won't be content in simply arguing that he is the heir to Henry VI. Instead, he will begin arguing that he is actually the rightful king. With the help of Earl of Warwick, he will be crowned, and we will get a new stage in the Wars of the Roses. Thank you for listening, and I hope you've enjoyed another edition of Mr. Lash's Digital Classroom.